some research came out actually after Real Food for Pregnancy was published, where they looked at first ever study looking specifically at protein requirements in postpartum women. They were 3 to 6 months postpartum, exclusively breastfeeding, and their protein needs were higher than an average female athlete.
Wow.
So one of the major challenges and areas that I would focus on if animal foods are a small part or not a part of your diet at all would be to prioritize your protein. And in those instances, I actually would recommend tracking. So how much are you actually getting? And then we have to really kind of get honest with how much of the protein in a food are we actually utilizing, because protein quality in plant foods, like how much our body can utilize, is significantly less than for animal foods, which means you may need to aim even higher than an average female athlete to make up for the fact that some of that won't be bioavailable.
Lily Nichols, thank you so much for coming onto this podcast, and a very, very warm welcome. I know that this topic that we're going to be speaking about today is so, so important for so many women out there. You are an expert in prenatal and postnatal nutrition and lifestyle health, and just how to be your best self when you're going through these stages of pregnancy. And I just thought this would be a really fascinating topic, and I would absolutely adore the opportunity to chat about postpartum, the postpartum phase, or as you would call it, the fourth trimester. Because so many women are struggling postpartum. But then also after the postpartum period as well, there are so many women who have had kids, but who never really feel the same afterwards. So I thought it'd be a fascinating conversation, and you're definitely the person to speak with. So Lily Nichols, a very warm welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I love talking about postpartum, so I love that topic. It's near and dear to my heart.
Right. You have a child of your own, don't you? Do you have one?
I have 2
Oh,
children.
you have
Yep.
two, right? Because I looked on your website and I saw one, and I was like, okay, so she must have one. But so you have two, right? And what are their
Yes.
ages?
My oldest is almost 8, and my younger one is 4.
Wow. Okay. So in general, so I have a question for you, because for me, I have 2 children as well. I have a child who's 2, so it's quite tough time.
Yep.
And I also have a 5-year-old. So I'm technically out of the postpartum period, technically,
Right.
but like so many women, I feel like I'm not quite the same as I was before I had children. So my first question, just out of interest to you, how do you feel after having kids? How are things for you?
Yeah.
Kids are older now. Like, how are you doing?
Well, interestingly, I mean, so first off, I'll say, I don't know that we're meant to be return to being the same person after we have kids.
Interesting.
There is a transition in your just mindset and way of being in the world from like maiden world to motherhood. And I think we need to like normalize and also like celebrate that transition. It's a good thing to be a different person, to embody a different way of being when you become a mother. I mean, you can't go back to being a maiden. You'll try to fight with it, and people will really wrestle with it, but it's ultimately a positive thing, and the only way out is through. So I'll just throw that out there. I think the transition is a good thing. Whether or not you feel like yourself, or how I'm feeling now, I mean, I think certainly there's many different phases that you go through. Like I even teach a professional webinar in postpartum recovery and nutrient repletion, and I extend the timeline out all the way to 2 years, because I think you really do need like a full 2 years. I mean, a lot of immediate stuff is going on in that first week or 2 weeks is like massive transition. The first month, the first couple months, like when you start introducing solid foods to your baby, like all of these things are big milestones and big shifts, but it really is a gradual healing process. So, well, no, I don't really feel like postpartum and feel more like myself, and I'm getting more sleep now, thankfully. Um, I don't know if it's my kids or other or just the way that I experience motherhood, but when your kids are really young, they need you very intensely, and that gradually they need you less and less over time, but that kind of comes in waves, right? So I remember the first time I could like actually lay my baby down and they napped kind of for a little while, not on me, and like, wow, this is amazing. Or when they start becoming mobile and you don't have to physically go to them and move them from place to place, like they can start moving themselves and then they start walking, like they keep getting these layers of independence, which to you is so freeing, like, oh my gosh, I don't have a baby in my arms at all times. Like, but I've actually found, you know, maybe I just have more patience for the newborn or early toddler phase. I find it a bit more challenging in the older toddler phase when, um, you know, they're fully verbal. They sort of know good behavior from not so good behavior and good manners from not having good manners. But they still, ultimately, their brain is not developed to the place where they can fully regulate like an adult. And I find that gets challenging for me. I really have to practice the patience. Age 4 in particular has been one of the more challenging phases with both of my kids. So my younger one's 4, so I feel like I'm very much in it. And some days are really wonderful and some days are really challenging. And it's just, as a parent, there's a lot of negotiation. I feel
Yeah.
like like everyone's like should be like every parent is some sort of expert lawyer. You're like negotiating with sometimes the most seemingly irrational things. They're a big deal to the kid, but to you, you're like, what? You asked for your banana to be cut this way. Why is this a meltdown, right? Um, but yeah, I think for me, it's like about sort of building that resilience and patience for those stages and trying to not get tired of like how much you really do have to repeat yourself as a parent
Right.
calmly, patiently. I am not always perfect at not losing my cool, to be fully real. But yeah, I find this stage it's not as physically demanding on my body, but emotionally and mentally, I actually think it's more taxing the later toddler years. Like terrible twos, like twos were fairly easy with the kids. When they're not fully verbal, you can't really get mad at them for like throwing a tantrum, right? They can't express what they want. Like once they're at the age where they can express what they want, it's just like, and then they choose not to. You're like, just use your words, honey. Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I just find that my resilience to stress was a lot better pre-kids. So if I was going to get stressed before kids, I feel like chemically my body was able to handle it better. Like, there must be some sort of chemical reason why. But since having children, my resilience is a lot less. So, when I get
Yeah.
stressed, I fly off the handle. And
Hmm.
when I get stressed, I'm shaking and I'm kind of like I'm a lot more likely to compound the stresses, like one on top of the other. Oh, now this
Yeah.
is happening, now this is happening. So it's almost like my body isn't dealing with the stress as well. And
Yeah.
I feel like that is definitely linked to having kids and whatever happened in my body during that time. Um, it's a stressful time, like it's a really hard
It
time
is.
for parents. And another question actually that came to me, for you who is a successful entrepreneur, you have programs, you have books, you have, so many clients and so many things going on now, and you're a leader in this field. How are you dealing with balancing entrepreneurship with motherhood?
Well, I will say that I mean, part of the freedom of being an entrepreneur is that you can choose how heavy your load is at different periods of time. And, you know, some of this is certainly like a privilege. I'm not the sole breadwinner, so I have taken, you know, your business takes a hit, but I did take time off with both kids. I didn't have to ask anybody's permission. I just had to see if it was financially feasible for me to not work for a number of months. So with both kids, I did bare minimal work for like 4 months, really planned ahead for postpartum. Now that's tough. I mean, I already had an established business for many years before I had kids, but I did intentionally like pre-plan and work on a lot of things in advance, book out a lot of clients, or like make sure that I had some like financial padding to allow that. And that again, that's like in a way a luxury that entrepreneurship affords, but also I'm not getting any subsidized maternity leave or anything from anybody, right? So it comes on you. So I've really just for myself, I had to make the conscious choice that like this is going to be a slower time and to like reduce my expectations. Even as I like eased back into work, I really reduced my expectations on how much I was going to get done. And for me, of course, like when you have one, it's also different than two. With my first one, I could get away with like very little childcare. I did, I mean, I started writing Real Food for Pregnancy at 10 months postpartum after my first. And a lot of that was like, I was like writing and researching stuff on my phone. And then when I'd get like nap time and this child would not be put down, I'd be like, you know, baby wearing, bouncing on a yoga ball, like typing up whatever notes that I had taken on my phone or research that I had found. I'd get my like 15 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe two here or there, and like just make the best of whatever time I had. But with one, I mean, when that child's sleeping, the house is silent and it's like quiet and you're not interrupted. Looking back, that's like quite a luxury that I didn't, you know, really appreciate at the time. And then I slowly started to build in some childcare in the home. I mean, we're talking like 9 to 12 hours a week, like not really enough to fully run a business.
Yeah.
But enough for the level that I wanted to work and for how much I was comfortable being away from my son at the time. And I absolutely loathed pumping, but we were still breastfeeding. And so I could just nurse, you know, oh, you need to interrupt me and nurse, great. And then like, here's the baby back. And then with my second, well, it got interrupted by COVID. So I was like just trying to come back from maternity leave and establish childcare. And then like COVID hit. So like no childcare, nothing. So that was actually a slower return to work than I had anticipated just by circumstance, as many parents found themselves in. Nowadays, I do still, again, childcare, like you have to have some time, uninterrupted time where somebody else is handling the kids. And that's there's no easy answer on the childcare thing because there's no perfect solution on childcare in the home, out of the home, school, homeschool, you know, this level of nanny, this, you know, part-time, you know, college age babysitter, like there's no good solution. There's pros and cons to all of them. And it is a really challenge. The biggest challenge actually in my business these days has been maintaining consistent childcare. So there have definitely been times when I've been out of childcare for a long period of time, and I'm just like scraping together bare minimum to keep the business running or to keep the projects going that I need to, outsourcing things as much as possible to my team. But there's certain things you can't outsource. Like I wish I could clone my brain. I can't. So I think as a business owner, I've just very much also lowered my own expectations, and I keep, other than right now where I'm at a very busy time, I try to keep the number of projects and things that I'm working on at the same time as minimal as possible. So people on the outside might be like, oh my gosh, you have these books and you have this program and this course and this whatever.
Right.
And you have to remember, like, this has been over a decade in development. I did not write multiple books at the same time. Those were written like years apart. Programs were launched years apart. The hundreds of blog articles on my website, those have been written over the years. It's not like I'm writing 5 at one time, So I very much am like, try to maintain the consistency, but do things slow and steady so I don't get completely overwhelmed. Because if my nervous system is a wreck, and there are time periods where you're launching a website or something, or a program or a book or whatever, like shit's gonna hit the fan. It just is for a period of time. But I don't like to stay there. So I am pretty unapologetic about just prioritizing like nervous system reset so I don't lose it. Otherwise, like I would just throw in the towel, like burn the whole thing down. It's just like not worth it if I'm not feeling well.
And this is a really good lesson to share, because just pacing yourself, and taking your time, and letting women know that to have their professional life and to have children, it just takes time. You don't have to rush
Yes.
anything, and that's such a good lesson. And to hear your experience actually is quite reassuring. You're like, look, I didn't do all of this just like that, which so many of us want. These days things come so quickly to us. um to know that someone like yourself has taken your time with everything, and it's taken years to get to where you are, it's quite reassuring. But you were talking about your first book, and I just wanted to bring it up here. It's on my
Yes.
Kindle, so you can, that's a bit of reflection there, but it's a really fabulous book. This is your first, right?
That was actually my second. My
Your
first one was
second.
Real Food for Gestational Diabetes.
Was that
Yeah.
your first? Oh, okay, so
Mhm.
Real Food for Pregnancy. This is a fabulous book. And I just wanted to start with a quote that I picked up from the postpartum section. So you say, our busy modern world seems to pretend that once you give birth, you're good to go. Everyone wants to pamper pregnant women, but postpartum, after a few weeks, it's as if people expect you to carry on with business as usual. And I think that's such a powerful quote, because it's just such a reflection of how it is in our modern society. We all feel so much pressure to bounce back, get our bodies back, get straight back to work, get back to normal day life. I was exactly the same. So I remember the day after I gave birth to my second child, I drove myself to my doctor's appointment the day after, and I was carrying my baby in the carrier. And none of the nurses could believe it. They were just like, oh my God, you're amazing. You're my hero. Look at you. You gave birth yesterday. You're here. And I was just feeling like it was silly of me, because I was just feeling so proud of myself. I was like, I'm really good at this. This is what I
Yeah,
do.
right.
And I was congratulated. And that's what our society is like. We celebrate women just getting straight back to it. But
Yeah.
in your book, when you discuss postpartum, you go into great detail about how in other cultures that is just not the case. And actually, if I was to do that in, let's say, Cambodia, or if I was to do that in Mexico, I wouldn't be congratulated. I'd probably be angrily sent home and just like, you should
Yeah.
be resting.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to start with is your postpartum journey. How were things for you? Because I know that you learned a few lessons along the way postpartum. So, what made you write these books? What made you specialize in this? And how did that play into your postpartum journey?
Yeah. Well, I mean, before I wrote any of my books, I had worked in the prenatal field for a while,
Mm.
um, particularly a lot of work in the gestational diabetes space, clinically and at the public policy level at the state of California. So I had a pretty good handle on nourishment during pregnancy, had quite a bit of client work as well, but a lot of that really focusing on pregnancy, right? Um, my education on postpartum nutrition, I mean, there really is no like education out there on postpartum nutrition, and it's kind of ignored. So other than the adage of eat like 500 extra calories a day when you're nursing, that's really about it. Like nobody's really talking about postpartum. So I went into my postpartum experience with my second a little bit, or with my first rather, first baby, um, a little bit naive. I think like many first-time moms, I had focused a lot of my energy on, taking great care of myself before and during pregnancy and planning for the birth. So much planning around the birth. Oh my gosh. And then very little planning around postpartum. I mean, I had heard it was a good idea to pre-prepare some meals, but I'm pretty efficient in the kitchen, and so I just was like, yeah, I mean, I'll prepare some, but I'm already like so quick at throwing together like a slow cooker meal or like throwing some eggs on in the morning. It was like, how hard can that be, right? Um, Plus my first came at 39 weeks, so I started some postpartum meal prep at like 38 weeks, but I was only like I had only prepped a handful of things. I had just assumed, like so many first-time moms, I'd just go to 41 weeks, right? And that didn't happen. And so I think I was just surprised at how crazy depleted I felt. I did have a bit of a longer labor, like almost a full day. And so I felt just completely wiped out, exhausted, like I'd run a marathon or something, and so hungry. I was really, really fortunate that I had some friends who already had children who set up a meal train for me. So we did have people in our community, some that I didn't even know, delivering meals to us. And that was really, really helpful. Even if like the food they're cooking wasn't necessarily my favorite, or some of them knew I was a dietitian, so they're sending me like boneless, skinless chicken breasts and brown rice and broccoli with like no salt, no butter, no any. So we're like adding all the salt and butter and cheese and flavor and calories to things because it like I needed like sustenance,
Yes.
But I just remember being, yeah, blindsided by how exhausting it is, how much the sleep deprivation compounds and how quickly, and yeah, how you're really don't have the wherewithal or free arms or, confidence to baby wear a newborn or whatever to be up and cooking
Mhm.
right away. You really need to rely on your village. So I was actually able to stay pretty well nourished, and other than being kind of shocked at just like, wow, how intense this is, I had a pretty good recovery. But that certainly inspired me to write a very long chapter on postpartum in Real Food for Pregnancy. I mean, like I said, I started writing it within that first year, so I was still in the thick of it, still nursing, still not getting a full night's sleep. Um, and then with my second, I knew better. Other than like aligning, a birth team that I wanted, I spent virtually no time preparing for the birth because there's like nothing really to prepare. You just sort of surrender to the process and have a supportive people there to help out. And did a lot of work preparing for postpartum. So like about halfway through the pregnancy, I was like, okay, I'm gonna get anytime I make a meal that would work well as a freezer meal, I'm gonna make like double portion and freeze it. So I had months worth of food stocked up in the freezer. We had like a brief meal train, but not as much. We were living in a different area at that time. And I also invited my mom to come and stay with us. And she was with us for about a month. So I invited and accepted help,
Mm.
um, and just kept my expectations of myself really low. Now, interestingly, that birth was only a few hours, super smooth, like easiest birth you could ask for. And so I did not feel completely depleted by that. And I had kind of learned just how much more protein you need when you're nursing. And so I was not as much swinging between like, I'm starving, and then like famished, eating a lot and then famished and eating a lot and then famished, because I had like got my macros into a better place. Like I really needed a lot of protein. So I was just really diligent about staying nourished. And I felt like my recovery was great, and it was faster than, my first. Still, inevitably, you're exhausted because of like sleep and you're nursing around the clock. And, still, of course, my appetite was super high, but I was really diligent about nourishment and keeping my expectations of how much I could get done in a day, you know, at a
And that
reasonable level.
right. And that just proves that what you teach actually works. So getting rest, getting
Yeah.
support, eating the right food to support your body and help you heal, like that stuff actually works. And it's something that women need to take note of and they need to actually start doing. So when it comes to, you said that, you invited your mother to stay for a month, and that's a really good practice. That's something that, so many of us don't actually do. Can you just go into a little bit the different cultures? So in your book, you have this great chapter on how different cultures actually treat postpartum women. And I just think it's great. So for example, there's this one, one example that I thought sounded awesome. So in Cambodia, women do something called roasting on a bamboo bed, a bamboo shoot bed. And I just thought, oh my God, I love the idea of that. So after having a baby, they lie on a warm bed and they're there for 3 days. And I just think those practices are so nourishing for the mother. So can you just go into just a little bit, just how different cultures are so different from us and what we can take from them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a lot of overlap in what many other cultures practice around postpartum. So there is often a 40-day period where you're encouraged to rest and recover.
Mm,
And it can be, the exact time frame can differ a little bit depending on the country, but that's a pretty common length of time, those 40
mm,
days, which interestingly aligns with the first 6 weeks that in Western culture they tell you is your postpartum recovery period. But
right.
our expectations of what you're doing during that time are very different in the West from some of these other cultures. So depending on where you look, there's often recommendations to stay in bed for a certain amount of time or stay in home for a certain amount of time. Avoid exposure to cold, windy, damp weather. Like there's a lot about keeping the mother warm. And some of this, arguably circles back to times when we didn't have like climate controlled houses and like your home was cold if it was cold outside and you needed to stay all bundled up inside. Like now we have heat and
Yeah.
air conditioning and whatever to keep us more comfortable. So some of those things I think we need to take with a grain of salt. But there is this big emphasis on staying warm, not only like physically in your space, but also with the food that you're consuming is often warming foods, things that
Mhm.
are going to like boost your chi or your energy. And you see that a lot, especially in parts of Asia like China, Korea, Thailand, Cambodia. There's an emphasis on warming soups and stews, things that have warming spices like ginger, we often think of as warming. That's
Mhm.
really common in that part of the world and others as well. And you see the same thing with warming soups and stews in other parts of the world too. You see it in Africa, you see it in Mexico, you see it in Peru, where it's often an animal-based stew, like a piece of meat with the bone or a whole chicken, or in China, it's pig trotter soup. In Korea, they make like a seaweed soup that's usually in a beef bone broth
Mhm.
base. And this like tough collagenous cut of meat is cooked into a broth. And then, of course, you add in all the other yummy, flavorful ingredients with it as well. But you're really emphasizing like fluids, electrolytes. There's protein in there, and there's a lot of, specifically on the protein front, a lot of collagen, which you need
Mhm.
quite a bit of to support your body's healing process. Your uterus has a ton of collagen. It's like completely remodeling your connective tissues that were all stretched. Some of them may have been torn or cut,
Yeah.
depending on how birth went down. And those all need that to recover. Your breasts, as your milk comes in, your breasts get engorged and the tissues in there are stretching. That's requiring more collagen. All the, skin on your stomach that got stretched beyond capacity when you were pregnant now is remodeling. We need collagen to help that happen. So it makes sense that there's some, collagen
Yeah.
rich foods tend to be emphasized. I don't know if you want me to go into like more specifics culture to culture, but I like to kind of highlight the overlap because there really is quite a bit.
I
Even
mean,
if there's
that's,
differences regionally, it's
yeah.
like warming foods over cold raw foods, like warming cooked foods, easy to digest, highly nutrient dense, high
Mm.
protein, are a really common thread.
So this naturally leads to a question about people's diets, because you mentioned how different cultures have animal foods as a big part of their diet. So what would you say to someone who's a vegetarian, or they prefer to avoid meat, or they're vegan? What would you say to someone in that situation? And they're like, right, well, how do I heal if, I'm not eating
Yeah.
animal foods?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I think you also need to kind of level set what your priorities are and just get really honest with yourself with how you feel. Certainly for somebody who's vegetarian, like lacto-ovo vegetarian and has milk and eggs as an option, you
Hmm.
can include those foods certainly. And those are commonly in parts of the world where those foods are consumed a lot. Those are often included in postpartum menus. Um, I will say that, some research came out actually after Real Food for Pregnancy was published, where they looked at first ever study looking specifically at protein requirements in postpartum women. They were 3 to 6 months postpartum, exclusively breastfeeding, and their protein needs were higher than an average female athlete.
Wow.
So, uh, uh, one of the major challenges and areas that I would focus on if animal foods are a small part or not a part of your diet at all would be to really to prioritize your protein. And in those instances, I actually would recommend tracking. Um, so how much are you actually getting? And then we have to really kind of get honest with how much of the protein in a food are we actually utilizing, because protein quality in plant foods, like how much our body can utilize,
Mhm.
is significantly less than for um, animal foods, which means you may need to aim even higher than an average female athlete to make up for the fact that some of that won't be bioavailable,
Mhm.
and to include as great a variety of sources within the confines of whatever dietary restrictions you follow, to ensure the best possible balance of amino acids. So there's fewer shortcomings there. So uh, protein would be, a really major place to focus. And I would say for all women, but particularly those who lean more plant-based, continuing your supplementation,
Mhm.
um, comprehensive prenatal vitamin, source of DHA, if you're not doing fish, an algae-based DHA supplement, because you also need those nutrients. Your micronutrient stores are in the toilet after having a baby.
Right.
Sorry. They're never going to be, you're never going to end pregnancy with nutrient stores higher than when you went into it.
Mhm.
And not only for your own healing, your mental well-being, because we do know there's a lot of nutrients that can impact risk for like maternal mental health issues, but also the levels of micronutrients in your breast milk are, for many micronutrients, not all, reflective of your maternal nutrient stores and or intake. Arguably both, depends on the nutrient and how our body transfers those things into breast milk. But there are really, really major concerns for the baby getting enough, like DHA, for example. Vegans have the lowest DHA levels in breast milk of any population group. Or vitamin B12, like deficiency in that can cause permanent neurological damage in 50% of infants who experience this. And you don't start to see those issues until they go through their own stores, which is usually 4 to 6 months out. So definitely continuing with whatever supplementation you were doing in pregnancy, continuing
Mhm.
that postpartum is absolutely crucial. So it's in those cases, particularly when like there might not be a source or sufficient amounts of some nutrients in food, supplementation becomes really, really important. People don't realize, but your nutrient needs during postpartum are higher than during pregnancy. And yet that's the time when people are like, well, my job is done, I
Yeah.
built this baby, I
I can
birthed
eat
this
what I want, I
baby,
can do what
I'm
I want.
good. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like, actually, this is the time to really like double down on it.
Right.
And that's hard, like mental capacity for keeping track of things, that's hard. Sometimes you forget your supplements. If food isn't like prepared for you and presented to you, you might be accidentally skipping meals or relying on, whatever snacks or bars are handy just because you're so famished.
Yes. Yeah.
So to draw it all the way back to the community component, you need that community to help support you, bring the things to you so you can eat
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and stay nourished. Yeah.
So what actually happens during the pregnancy and the labor where we do become so depleted? Like, what do we tend to become depleted in, and why? Like, what is happening to our body? Because when we give birth and the postpartum period, I think we're just not educated enough in what you've just said, that we are depleted, that, our micronutrients are at an all-time low and our requirements are at an all-time high, which puts us at immediate disadvantage. And we have to work really hard during that time. And to not replenish can lead to long-term health problems for women, health problems that they're stuck with for good. So what actually happens during that time? What micronutrients are we losing the most during this time?
I mean, arguably, you're losing all of
All of
them.
them.
You're you have to remember, so,
Oh gosh,
during
we've got
pregnancy,
it hard,
okay.
haven't we?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's going on in your body? Okay, so you have grown a brand new human being who has a brain and organs and
Blows my mind.
bones and skin and all the tissues. You've grown a placenta, like a
Mm,
brand new, very large organ. It's arguably very similar to a liver in
it's
many of its
huge.
functions, and it's
Yeah.
huge, and it kind
Yeah.
of looks like liver. It's like
Yeah.
if your placenta's healthy, it's like rich maroon color, right?
Yeah.
And fairly large. And then your body has undergone a ton of adaptations in order to facilitate this baby's growth. Your circulatory system has changed, your hormone production has changed, your thyroid produces, 50% more thyroid hormone throughout pregnancy. Your uterus, goes from the size of a pear to the size of a watermelon. All of your connective tissues and skin have stretched to accommodate that. It's wild what the body has done. All your internal organs reorganized to
Mhm.
like allow that baby to grow. And then, of course, birth itself is any combination of like a, a marathon, possibly a marathon with abdominal surgery at the end if there's an emergency C-section, or a C-section alone is major abdominal surgery, which if you have surgery, how long do doctors usually recommend you recover and rest? I mean, often like 6 weeks or
In
so,
the
but
hospital,
yet you
yeah.
need to
Right.
be, you know, 24/7 caring for this baby, often with
Yeah.
insufficient care for yourself. Um, and then postpartum, okay, when baby is born, there's a dinner plate size wound inside your uterus left by the placenta when it detaches. That needs to heal. Your hormones go through the most dramatic shift that they
Mhm.
will ever go through in your lifetime, where you like are switching from hormones of pregnancy to hormones of lactation. Your
Mhm.
thyroid gland needs to completely remodel. Your breasts are undergoing massive changes as your milk starts to come in. Um, it's wild what your body is doing. Not to mention you've just like loaned a whole bunch of nutrients to this baby, and then you're going to continue
Mhm.
to share that nutrition with your baby via your breast milk if you're choosing to nurse. And that is arguably a greater nutritional depletion even than the pregnancy itself. I mean, breastfeeding is just a huge drain on your resources. Just from energy needs alone, your energy requirements for lactation
I
are
mean,
much higher than they are for pregnancy.
just you like going through that, it just emphasizes how much our body goes through and how much we need to recover and we need to look
Yeah.
after ourselves after that phase is so, so important. Otherwise, that's why so many women don't feel the same ever again. Like, not just because they're mothers and because they have a new role, but because physically they just haven't topped up over the years. They just haven't
Yes.
topped up. How long do you think it takes for a woman to top up after having a baby? Like realistically?
I mean, I'm of the opinion that it's a full 2 years
Two
to really
years,
fully
yeah.
recover.
Mm,
Your most intense period of recovery, arguably, is in that first 3 to 6 months,
mhm,
and in that first year. Especially in cases where you're continuing to breastfeed beyond that time point. I mean, there's a continual drain of your of your energy and micronutrients via your milk. Breast milk doesn't suddenly become nutritionally hollow after a certain time period. Like you're
mhm,
still transferring energy, nutrients, vitamins, minerals uh, through your milk.
mhm,
So I think prolonged lactation, and been there, done that, like nursed my kids both like almost 2.5 years. Like it's a continual
mhm,
pull from your nutritional resources. Um, so yeah, I do recommend giving it a full 2 years. The
mhm.
like level at which you need to focus on repletion certainly probably declines over time, depending on how voracious of a nurser your
Yes,
toddler is, right? So
yeah,
some babies, they take to solid foods fairly quickly and nursing becomes less interesting to them. Other kids don't take to solids quite as well or still really want to nurse quite a bit. And so the more you're nursing, the more of a drain that is on your resources. So yeah, it depends.
and I just wanted to focus in on some really common conditions that women face after giving birth. So I guess depending on how hor horrific is the wrong word, how much blood they lost during the labor, and just how much blood they've lost during their lifetime, really. How often do you see anemia and low iron, low B12? Is that common in women who have just had children?
Very common.
Mhm,
Anemia affects about 30% of women postpartum.
mhm,
And some of that does depend on the amount of blood that was lost during birth. So
mhm,
for women who lose a lot of blood at birth, their risk of anemia can be upwards of 75-fold higher than a woman who lost a typical amount of blood. There's always blood loss during delivery. That's a normal physiological part of the process.
mhm.
But when it becomes like a, hemorrhage sort of situation, yeah, it's very common. Prevalence of B12 deficiency, I don't know that that is, um, I don't know of a study that has measured that specifically in postpartum mothers. So time period that is least studied, in
Mm.
my opinion, um, in humans is postpartum.
Is
A
that
lot
because
of the
it's too
research around
risky?
postpartum focuses on, milk supply, quantity or quality, how that affects the baby, and
Mhm,
less so on moms themselves, maternal needs, maternal rates of deficiency. Um, B12 deficiency is more common among people who are not consuming B12 rich foods. So we
mhm,
certainly see it at a much greater rate in vegans primarily, slightly less so in vegetarians, and then it's less common in omnivores because you get your B12 from animal foods.
mhm,
But a lot of it depends on diet or whether you were supplementing and whether you were supplementing with a sufficient amount.
mhm,
I should like throw out there that there's some research showing that the vitamin B12 recommendation should probably be at least tripled for pregnancy and lactation to prevent a deficiency in mothers. So, if you're taking a prenatal and the daily value box says 100% of the RDA, that's 3 times too low,
Mhm.
right? And particularly vegetarians and vegans need a separate higher dose vitamin B12 supplement to prevent deficiency. So don't assume you're fine just because you have a prenatal and it says 100%. Like you might actually need more.
Mm.
And you could request blood work to check that. Your serum B12 levels or your MMA levels could give you an indication of whether you need more B12 than you're getting.
And would you say that low iron and anemia, would you say it's underdiagnosed? And a lot of women are walking around postpartum, coming back with normal blood work for their iron levels, but they've got all of the symptoms of anemia. Do you find that it's an underdiagnosed condition and that all women should take it seriously, all of them? Like when they've given birth, it makes sense to try and replenish your iron stores. And if so, how would you recommend she goes about doing that?
Yeah, well, I don't think many providers are really checking labs
Mm.
early on. I mean, arguably, if you're going to check anyone's labs in the first like month postpartum, we're all deficient and everything.
Yes, yeah.
Um, so you probably don't even bother until maybe 6 weeks out. If you're feeling really like woozy, low energy, I mean, certainly go in and get it checked sooner. There can be a lot of potential reasons. Anemia is one of many
Mhm.
that could be playing a role there. But anemia is and iron levels and everything. It's really tricky. A lot goes into red blood cell production beyond just iron. So you can
Mhm.
be anemic even if your iron is fine. Although I think most postpartum women are probably would benefit from some more iron-rich foods. Um, we need to think about complementary nutrients though as well that can improve like iron utilization and support red blood cell production. So just taking iron doesn't necessarily fix the issue. And depending on the type of
Yeah.
iron can really be a not a great idea in early postpartum because they could be very constipating. And the last thing
Mhm.
you want to be early postpartum is
Right.
constipated.
Yeah, no, you don't
So
want to be
like
pushing out of
caution,
that. Yeah,
yeah,
no more
ferrous
pushing.
sulfate, ferrous fumarate, like I would not be taking those postpartum. If you need to take an iron supplement, an iron bisglycinate